All right, let's get the show started. I'm so very excited to welcome everybody. My name is Per Marcus. I am the regional chair for Vänsterpartiet, the left party in Uppsala region. And I'm going to say this, my preferred pronoun is he or they. I'm really excited to have you here today for our absolutely fabulous panel discussion about the international LGBT movement, LGBTQI movement, what we can learn from each other, and to spread knowledge about the situation for LGBTQI people around the world. And with me, I think I have to say, the most impressive panel I've seen in a very, very long time. And I'm not going to introduce you guys. Instead, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourself. And I would like you to say your name, preferred pronoun, and tell us a little bit about yourself. So how about that we start with Faris? Why don't you start?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Faris Cuchi, Gezahegn. I'm originally from Ethiopia, but currently lives in Vienna. And my preferred pronouns is they, them. I identify as femme, non-binary body. I've been an activist and an advocate for LGBTI rights in Ethiopia, and then now in the diaspora for about 8 years. I co-founded a couple of organizations, both in Ethiopia and now also in the diaspora space. And currently I'm a co-founder of House of Guramayle. House of Guramayle is an intersectional LGBTI advocate organizations that works on in a very specific manner to challenge the Ethiopian government on policies and legislations that discriminate and exclude queer Ethiopians. And also we work on telling our own stories, archiving our own stories, demystifying information that is dehumanizing our existence as an Ethiopian and as a human being at large. And I'm also an active member of Afro Rainbow Austria here in Austria. It's an African LGBTI organization.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me here.
We are so excited. And we're going to speak more about your work in a little while. But just to take this right now, if we want to learn more about House of Guramayle, where can we read them? Are you on Facebook, for example?
Yes, we do have our own official website, www.houseofguramayle.org. And also we are on Instagram, we are on Facebook, and we are on Twitter as well. So on Facebook, we are Facebook.com/House of Guramayle. And on Instagram, we are also Instagram/House of Guramayle. And on Twitter is capital HO and Guramayle with G capital.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. So,
thank you for having me.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Say again?
Monica, can you?
Oh. Okay. Well, thank you, Marcus and Alexandra. Thank you. Glad to be here. My name is Monica Joy Cross. I go by she, her, and they. I am involved in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. It's a mainline denomination that's pretty much left-leaning. We work with the Poor People's Campaign, Black Lives Matter. I'm also part of the Auburn Seminary, which is a seminary out of New York. And we focus on progressive theological issues, trying to shift the church. And it's a slow, gradual process. So there's still issues in certain areas of the church that really it's more about Jesus than being Jesus. It's a whole different story. So we had to deal with the evangelical part of our church in the United States, which is kind of different. and they're anti-LGBTQ. So we're still trying to work that out. We realize that people take their faith to the voting booth. And a lot of policies that come out of a very slaveholders type faith, which is very anti-LGBTQI and the rest of the family alphabet. I'll close by saying a lot of what I do focuses on the basic needs. So if a lot of trans folks, the ones I meet anyway, I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody, but a lot of them can't get work. They go through discrimination, the whole 9 yards. Things are changing, but still a lot of work to do. So though we do have some high profile trans folks like Laverne Cox and others, and Janet Mock and others, the vast majority of trans women of color, Black trans women, is not like that. And so a lot of the other work is shifting the conversation so we can be more inclusive. And a lot of it is about white supremacy, but I won't go into that. I could be all day. Anyway, I'll stop right there.
You're going to have a lot of opportunity to speak about this. But I have to say, Monica, it's an absolute joy to have you here.
Yes.
So, Jay, why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Okay. Sorry. Hi, my name is Jay. I use they, them pronouns. I also use he, but I prefer they. I am a recently graduated student from the University of Minnesota. And I guess like for the past few months here, I've been organizing with a group of fellow activists and fellow former students to provide aid relief during the pandemic and sort of the aftermath of George Floyd's murder here in Minneapolis. I think that before all of this happened, I don't think that I would have really defined myself as an activist at all. Most of my time was spent doing school things, which I did. I was politically involved in college, obviously, but nothing like what I'm doing now. I've kind of been put in charge of a lot of things that I didn't feel qualified to do. But overall, like these past few months have like taught me more about activism and community organizing than, any amount of theory that I've ever studied. So I'm excited to be here. I'm also excited for Monica to talk about white supremacy and transphobia because that's a topic that's really important to me. So Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, of course, we're so excited to have you. It's an absolute delight, I have to say. For you, the audience who are listening in on Facebook and on the Zoom webinar, I want to say that in the end of this panel discussion, you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. But you can only do that through the Zoom webinar. So if you're listening in on Facebook, you should log in on the Zoom webinar and ask your absolute best question at the end of this panel discussion. But I wanted to begin this discussion with talking to each and every one of you around a few issues. And I wanted to start with you, Faris, and discuss your work with Horn of Africa Pride and organizing that, because as far as I have understood, it has been a really huge success, actually.
Yes.
Could you speak a bit more about that, please?
Well, it is kind of a little bit bittersweet because this way of communicating is really like prominent right now after COVID, and that comes with a lot of cost. to a lot of our fellow lives. But also at the same time, as a queer Ethiopian, our medium of communications and building community is through online, and Facebook and other mediums play a huge role in forming the community, and then also informing also our queer movement. So through this realizations, we just decided to for the first time, Horn of Africa that include Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia. And we wanted to include Djibouti, but unfortunately we couldn't find anyone that can collaborate with us. But it was a very successful event that actually we actually center ourselves. We discuss how we love each other and how we've been there for each other in the midst of hate and discrimination. We showcase the many and the multiple way we manifest and move through this world. It was very beautiful. It was curated in a most beautiful way. We celebrated, we cried, we talked about so many essentials topics, starting from financial independence to also fighting for our rights and challenging policies and legislations in Ethiopia, and also humanizing ourselves. So it touched. It was a 6-hour event, continuous event that comprised a bunch of artists, DJ sets, and panel discussions on different topics. It was very successful, and it was such a beautiful and emotional event.
Yeah, and obviously these kinds of events are needed all over the world, no matter if it's in Stockholm, in the United States, in the Horn of Africa. But could you explain why Horn of Africa is so especially needed right now, given the situation for LGBTQI people in Ethiopia particularly, but also in the Horn of Africa?
Well, Africa is a very complex continent, despite a lot of people confusing it with a country, but it's a huge continent that comprises a lot of countries, and our queerness manifests also in the same complex way. And for instance, if we go down to the south, the way the queer movement in the southern parts of Africa is very in a better state than in the eastern part of Africa, and then also in the west and north. But within even the eastern Africa is also for instance, if you compare and contrast Ethiopia and Kenya, and the queer movement that is in Kenya is absolutely different in Ethiopia. But through all these realizations, we know that it is very important for us also. One is to see each other as an Ethiopian, as an Eritrean, and as Somali. But it's also very important for us to put a stamp and make a history, saying okay, this part of Africa is actually very flourishing, yet it's not really well developed from the activism point of view. Not that I'm romanticizing our struggle, but it's still starting and needs a lot of attention and need a lot of focus so that we can elevate the issue that we're facing. So it was, for us, it was very, very important to capitalize on that and say we're here and we need actually a lot of supports and attention so that we can deal with the problems, because also in the existing space right now, due to the corona, there is a lot of new surging danger that is coming through homophobia and transphobia in a very amplified way, and we want to talk about that and highlight it. And also currently in Ethiopia, we are in a very heavy vibrations as a nation for so many issues, but at the same time also starting from blaming queer peoples for the cause of corona to the point of also any social issue that is attached with corona, for instance, gender-based violence to children and all those kind of things. And there is a very strong, heavy energy and hate that is directed to us, and we wanted to showcase in a different way and say we exist, we do here. Actually, we use the word Allen in Amharic. It's one of the languages that we use in Ethiopia, and it means we are here and we do exist, and we are not something foreign element.
Previously, both Monica and Jay mentioned white supremacy and LGBTQI issues. And of course, this is a global problem with white supremacy. And you are talking about how LGBTQI in the Horn of Africa, perhaps even in all of Africa, are viewed as something foreign and suspicion. Do you think that is tied in with the colonial history of Africa from European nations? And how does that affect the ability to integrate and affect the communities you're active in?
Absolutely. But also, not only also related to the colonial history of it, but also, again, also how we in the Western or in the global North, how we are painting and also advocating for queerness. Because if we, on a general aspect, if we are seeing this, there is an intention of erasing the contributions of Black body to the queer movement. And that does affect also how also in Africa people see or in Ethiopia people see queerness, because their reference is whiteness, and that also we also have to really as a queer movement generally, we have to see ourselves and really reflect how we are moving and how we are contributing to that. But through colonial movement, through the colonial history, through religion that came and preached homophobia and transphobia to Africa, because our ancestors actually understand and see sexualities and gender expressions and identities in a very vibrant, in a very not binary way, but in a more complex way. We do have a lot of ethnic groups actually existing in Ethiopia, for instance, now that are practicing such kind of way of living, and it is. So I see it in a multiple ways, which is also holding also the queer movement accountable for the intentional erasure of Black contribution to queer liberation.
Yeah. Thank you. And on the subject of religion, I'm going to pivot to you, Monica, and ask a little bit about you. You are working in a religious community and a religious context with LGBTQI matters, and I think the picture many of us have with religion and LGBTQI matters are that they're religious people are deeply homophobic, deeply transphobic, and anti-LGBTQI. But I have a feeling that you are going to argue that it's much more complicated than that. Can't you explain how these two movements work together in the United States?
Yeah. So I've been doing work in the church for quite a long time. So when I first came out back in the 80s, I wasn't called evil by a racist. It was an old Black woman that called me evil. Just evil. You're just plain evil. And I just come from church, dressed. I was in Virginia in my Sunday best, coming out of the Metropolitan Community Church, MCC in the area. And so it's in the mindset. It's in the fabric of the country I mean, because the country started out as a slaveholding nation, you know, plantations and stuff. And so what humanity looks like is very constricted. So then when, of course, you're being authentic, you're Black, you're trans, these kind of things, you just kind of mess the whole imagination up that folks have been grounded in for the last 400 years.
Yeah.
So 400 years, the idea has been that in the United States, people like Donald Trump determine what humanity is. And the church, which pretty much a church that advocates white supremacy on the right, and you can look through all the little media and you see that. Very, very anti-LGBTQI. And they have a huge media footprint because they're linked up with a lot of money. Now, on the left, where it's about progressive basic needs, and when we look at Jesus, is how do we do what Jesus did? Recognize that Jesus experienced a state execution because he cared about folks on the margins. Not much has changed. You know, it looks different. And so on the left, we focus on what that means. And that gets it involved in the Poor People's Campaign, which focuses on 140 million people, unemployed, hungry, a working class, trans, queer across the board. Also being part of the Black Lives Matter, which is shifted now because a lot of my colleagues are actually have a voice in Black Lives Matter. So what's different from the civil rights movement of, say, the 60s, where Bayard Rustin, who was gay, had to hide behind closed doors, and today is that trans folks are having more room. Queer folks are having more room. The LGBTQI community is having more room to speak and more voice in this moment. I think that the key is shifting the understanding of humanity and shifting this idea of sacred, because the way it is now, what is considered sacred is still pretty much heteronormative. Yeah. So examples, when I went to seminary, I'm ordained, only ordained, from what I understand, the only ordained person in my particular denomination. When I say that gender is a construct, or that is constructed and put together for the powers that be, while we might get that here to some extent, a lot of folks still don't get it. They're scared to get it, because if they get it, then that means everything they believe for the last 400 years, it's like, well, that's not true. So it's always continual education, continual being authentic in who we are, and then really going in on those front lines, going to the protests and stuff like that, and working for resolutions to shift that. So, and I'll say this. A couple of years ago, I went to what they call a General Assembly. I don't know if you have General Assemblies over there for your churches, where the whole church comes together. And there was a motion on the floor to learn about transgender issues and non-conforming issues, these kind of things, and queer issues. And they were going to vote it down, because the folks who are more conservative in our context, they weren't feeling trans folks having any kind of anything at all in that church. And so finally, a group of us got up and said, wait a minute, you're going to tell me that trans people don't have a space, that gender non-conforming people don't have a space, that queer people don't have a space? And for me, all I could think about was dead Black trans women because I realized who I am is very much about my community. So everywhere I go, I'm thinking about, like right now, in this year alone, so far, there have been 21 Black trans women who've been killed and murdered. And and those numbers, and that's just the ones that are reported. Yeah. So when someone tells me that, no, you can't have a space in here, I get really pissed off. So,
it wouldn't be that. But just one last question. We're going to move on to Jay just in a minute, but one last question, because what you're speaking about, if I understand you right, is really a strategy to shift other movements to become LGBTQI friendly in order to create a more inclusive and LGBTQI friendly society. And we are seeing a really interesting battle in Sweden right now in our largest church, the Church of Sweden, where right-wingers are trying to reclaim the church. Why is it so important that we try to build alliances with other movements and affect other movements, not only churches but also the labor movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, etc.? Why is it so important that we need to shift them in order to build, in order to further our own rights?
Yeah, because we're talking about building consciousness. We're talking about, in the U.S., while the trans community is becoming more and more powerful, they're scaring a lot of people to death because that shifts the whole imagination of what humanity looks like. And free people. So there's a big move to push back against that. So the federal government has wanted to just delete the category of transgender, just out of it. Take away transgender rights. Anything that's going to disrupt, because that's what we're doing. We're disrupting that imagination. And a lot of folks in the church are pushing back on that. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, we're moving forward. And it's not going to change. We're just going to continue to move forward. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. We're just going to continue to move forward because that's how that works. So we do the work, we do the strategy, and allyship, and this thing called fusion to move things forward.
Well, that sounds absolutely wonderful. God bless you, Monica. Before we move to you, Jay, I just wanted to say that Karthik has joined us, and I want to say a warm welcome to you. I'm going to let you speak in a moment, but I'm going to let in Jay. So we're moving from the church and the religious movement in the United States to the grassroots movement really now, because you have been, as you said before, quite active in basic need and support and things like that. Couldn't you speak more about why this is an important LGBTQI matter and why we need to pay attention to it?
Yeah, I think that one of the main things that I think makes it an LGBTQ issue is sort of some of what Monica was touching on of the way that white supremacy is so deeply tied to homophobia and queerphobia and transphobia in particular. And I think here there has been a lot of kind of strife around that and you can sort of see it in the memorial space for George Floyd. I helped organize a Pride March during Pride Month here, which is in June. And we went to the memorial site to put up flyers and to, sort of spread the word about the event. And there were several people that, when we walked in, actually, there was a woman that was yelling at someone that had a gay pride flag, yelling about how, this was the white people's curse and that, this had, been a blight on the Black community, just really going off. And it was very uncomfortable, to be in this space and to sort of be at the intersection of, this, very historic moment, but also realizing, I guess, how ingrained that prejudice is, and sort of realizing that, as a queer Black person, you're always going to be sort of fighting for straight and cis Black people, particularly Black men, knowing that they would never fight for you in the same way. And so just sort of like being in that space and trying to confront that in a way that like called people in without sort of intentionally fracturing the movement either. Like it's a very difficult balance of like, how do you talk to people about this and about the importance of really coming together in like a meaningful way, as opposed to just this sort of like cutesy, like unity kind of talk that has kind of been going around in the cities, and actually like, okay, like how can we have dialogue about this with our cis Black people, with our straight Black people, and like really sort of have a meeting like in a meaningful way. And I think that
have that kind of meeting.
I think that the meeting is a work in progress. It's a constant work in progress. I think that I have been able to have conversations with Black family members who have been previously homophobic, just random Black strangers that have like met me and been like, you know, like, what are you doing out here as like a trans person? Like, that's a white people thing. And sort of being able to like have dialogue about that, because I think it's so ridiculous, like the notion that like white queer people invented anything about like gay culture. I mean, like it's really like I'm gonna be super real, like it's ridiculous to say that, like
absolutely,
given how much white gay people and white queer people co-opted from Black queer people, the ballroom movement, like all of your phrases that you like to say on Twitter, like, you know, like it's not like you didn't make any of this up, you know what I mean? And so I think that having that conversation and being able to like point to specific examples of like, well, actually, like this was like the Black Panthers, for example. A lot of people in the US aren't even aware that, you know, Angela Davis was like a queer woman, that, you know, that there was a whole subset of the Black Panther Party that was really pro gay rights, and like being able to talk to people about that, I think sort of facilitates that meeting, but it's definitely not like a one and done situation for sure.
Yeah. So I really have two follow-up questions about what you said, which is so true and so interesting. And the first question I have is because you've spoken a lot about homophobia and transphobia within the Black community, but in the margins of what you're saying, you're really touching about another subject, which is racism within the LGBTQI community. I know for a fact that the LGBTQI movement in the United States, at least in parts of the United States, have, you know, moved further away from that than the LGBTQI movement in Sweden has, for a lot of different reasons. So if you could talk about how you have been successful about that. But you also, the other question I wanted to ask is, you talked about the subsection to the Black Panthers, but we also know that we have had similar subsections to the labor movements, the Win Lib movements, who was really carried by openly gay and trans women for a really long time. Do you think it's a successful strategy for the LGBTQI movement to be a subgroup to other movements like labor movements or Black Lives Matter or Black Panthers, or do you really think that we have reached more success by forming our own community, our own movement, and integrating other struggles such as the struggle against anti-Blackness and capitalism within our movement? Which strategy do you think have been most successful? So two really big questions at once. Shoot.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to answer the second question first. I think that I honestly don't think that it's necessarily fair to say that queer people haven't also led those movements necessarily. Like, I think that, you know, again, to use Angela Davis as an example, or Bayard Rustin, as Monica brought up earlier, like those people were instrumental in the success of like the mainstream like movement. And so like can you really say that they're a subset? And I think that that's more about sort of the historical framing of events and like how we talk about those events, like how we talk about who was leading what and who was instrumental where. I think that that's more, it's less about like what's a more effective strategy and more about like how are we sort of framing this information when we talk about it, and like how are we intentionally sidelining queer leaders in the movement. And so, yeah, I guess that's how I'd answer the second question. And then to the first question, yeah, can you like say like just a little bit more about your first question?
Just how have the LGBTQI movement in the United States, at least in part, successfully combated racism within our own community?
Yeah, I think I think that there's like a lot of movement forward on anti-racism in queer communities. I think that a lot of it honestly is kind of about what the movement has been doing for white people more generally, of just like really insisting that they confront their privilege. Like I think that queer white people really can blind themselves to the other privileges that they have, because they're like, oh, well, but I'm a queer person. Like I face transphobia or homophobia or what have you. And it's like, okay, but like oppression is a matrix, right? It's not like a checklist. Like it's a bunch of different like interacting issues that impact how you are able to move through the world. And so like, yes, you may be trans or you may be gay, but you're still white. Like you still have so much privilege, especially in this space, and especially in light of how white people have been able to co-opt Black culture for their financial benefit, for their social benefit. And so like I think that it's hard for white people in general to sort of grapple with white privilege. But I think in some ways it's even more difficult for white queer people to do it, because I think that it is so obvious that, you know, queer people don't have equal rights in the United States by and large. But that question of white privilege is hard for people to be like cognizant of, and like how those interactions like play out with other Black people who are also in the queer community.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Really, really interesting. And I think that it's a big problem in Europe and in Sweden, particularly about homo nationalists, homosexuals, especially white gay males, who joins racist and anti-immigration parties and spew out this kind of racism. So it's really interesting about how you talk about how it's not, as you say, a checklist, but a matrix. I really, really agree. I think that's really an insightful and powerful way to put it. So we're going to pivot now to Karthik. Welcome to the conversation. I'm so happy that you could join us, albeit a little late. That's our fault. I'm so sorry. So could you begin with just shortly introduce yourself? Who are you? What's your preferred pronoun? And what do you do?
My name is Bittu Karthik. My preferred pronouns are either they or he. They in the hopes for, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear it a bit.
Is this better?
Yeah, this is very much better.
Yeah, I'll do the user. Yeah, so I think Karthik, my pronouns are he, or, and they. Both, whichever people prefer. They in hopes of a world where, people don't have to necessarily be boxed into a gender. And if people, very often people who are not able to own themselves, in terms of use of the pronoun, so that we would be my preference. So these are my pronouns. I'm a genderqueer trans, and I'm essentially out of Delhi, in India. And I'm part of several organizations, unfunded collectives of trans persons. So I'm a member of the Intersex Committee, which is a mass organization of trans persons in the state of Canada. I lived there for a few years. I'm also active on other issues besides trans issues. I also think I'm very fortunate to be in a country where there's been thousands of years of historical organizing, especially by trans women, especially class and from marginalized castes and tribes. So, it's that legacy really changes the way in which trans activism happens here, and I'm just very honored to be.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to say the sound is still a little bit shaky, but I think we're going to manage. So you mentioned that it's been, thousands of years rich history in India about organizing and rebellion, and I wanted to focus on the situation today with the Hindu nationalist government under Modi. And the effect that has had on LGBTQI people, but also the fact that you actually have two quite recent big victories. Supreme Court decision that has strengthened rights for all LGBTQI people. And if you could explain a little bit more about those two Supreme Court decisions, please.
Yeah, happily. Yes, we are in an interesting position with this, the Hindu right-wing government that is coming up. For the following reasons. I mean, I also, since this is an international discussion, I really want to contextualize and make sure everyone understands the kind of danger that this right-wing government poses to all of us. This is the largest fascist Nazi-inspired, to be more precise, mass organization in the world, right? We're a country of 1 billion people, and a very large number of people in this country are part of this organization. And the three elements that one worries about: ideology, mass organizing, and government power, right? All three are currently in the hands of this very large right-wing organization. They have several mass fronts. They also are currently in government and show no signs of abating in popularity. And they're also, their ideology derives from the notion that the ways in which Jews were killed in Germany should be applied to Muslims today. That is their stated ideology. And so it's a very scary situation that we're living in. I should also issue trigger warnings for all of this, going forward. Yeah.
So if I understood you right, that what the right-wing government, the Hindu nationalist government, is saying is that the way the Holocaust was executed during the 30s and 40s in Europe is really something they want to emulate in regard to the Muslim minority in India.
Right. So it's a clever organizational setup. So the government does not say that. The government merely enacts various policies that disenfranchises Muslim communities. But the founder of the mass organization which preceded the political party wrote this in his writing, that we must admire the efficiency with which the Germans eliminated the Jews. So of course we have so we are very worried about the state of the country, and the government is currently busy, not just persecuting Muslims with full force, engineering and triggering riots, including in Delhi, which have largely been one-sided pogroms, jailing all activists who speak up about this. All of us are variously under threat, massive dilution of labor laws, and all marginalized castes and tribal groups are being targeted, and we have never been a country with a discourse around immigration. right? That's never been a discourse at all so far. But in the last year, the government has made it an issue through various laws around citizenship that claim to target people who may not have papers showing that they are citizens. Now, essentially, everybody who's poor in this country has difficulty having papers because the government functions so poorly at the level of just even basic documentation. So all poor people, all people from marginalized castes are, and trans people are affected by this. So up to 2,000 trans persons have been incarcerated in one state where a national registry of citizenship was sort of implemented, and 2,000 people are on the list of people whose citizenship is under doubt as per the final count of that state. And many, people are already getting incarcerated in detention centers. And our concern is what happens when a very large percentage of the population is locked up in detention centers, and how does, already there's very little reported from the overcrowded jails and detention centers in which people are being locked up. So that's the alarming situation in which we're working right now. Now, the position of trans people is very interesting because this is a right-wing Hindu government. There are various, historical old Indian Hindu myths specifically, which refer to transgender persons. They vary from being what some people find empowering to derogatory, but they acknowledge the existence of trans persons in Indian history. And so there have been tactical moves by a privileged section of a caste privileged section, essentially, of the transgender community to try and lay claim to that legacy and hope that the right-wing government will support trans persons in some way. At the same time, so this relates a little bit to the question that you asked about laws, right? So we've had 2 Supreme Court judgments, as you say, that have been very favorable for the LGBTQ community overall. But the only thing that has come from the government is a new transgender act, right? Which has just actually been released by the Gazette. And that the content of that act, it's called the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, right? And it does the opposite of that, right? It erodes rights that these Supreme Court judgments have given us, that they have endowed us with. So it's one of those situations where, as with many minority communities, the government says, we are for you, right? Likewise, this government says, we are all for Muslim women by criminalizing Muslim men. And for that matter, Muslim women have also been criminalized, right? And it's a similar approach that has ended up happening with the trans community, where the government says, we are all in favor of the trans community, but what's actually being handed to us is problematic. So what exactly is problematic? For that, I have to say what was valuable about these Supreme Court judgments. The first Supreme Court judgment came way back in 2014. And as per that judgment, transgender persons were accorded sort of essentially legal recognition. Not that we weren't persons prior to that, and the Constitution uses the word person, which is a gender-neutral term. So we still could claim constitutional rights. The judgment claimed that, however, our rights were enshrined through that judgment, and said essentially that we all had a right to self-recognition without any proof of surgery or sort of certification that trans persons had a right to self-declared gender, and that was illegal and immoral for governments to insist on various kinds of proof. That made a huge difference to the trans community, because just the logistics of, say, getting legal name changes and so on. I mean, there was really not a process prior to that, and these things changed after that. Although the history of the ways in which trans women, especially working class trans women, the ways in which they face violence on the streets, especially the majority of working class trans women from marginalized castes and tribes who essentially face complete employment boycott from mainstream society. So we have trans visibility, but as part of a caste system which organizes, rigidifies, and solidifies people into a division of laborers, with graded inequality at each level, right? So each group is placed somewhere in a hierarchy. Trans people are towards the bottom of that hierarchy and are considered, nobody will want a trans person in their space, whether it's an office space or even as a domestic worker in a domestic space. And so the majority of trans persons face a complete boycott in terms of interaction. Most people have to either beg, which the trans community does in an organized way through sort of self-support, self-sustaining mechanisms, or sex work. And these are both risky jobs because they involve being, very visible and present on the streets, constant clashes with law enforcement, which periodically does these drives to kind of push people out. And at any point, although we don't face, in the US, for example, I remember that we would face attacked just for being a visible kind of gender non-conforming person. One doesn't get attacked for being a trans so much as one in India, so much as in the course of being on the streets, one is seen as vulnerable and somebody who will not be able to file a case against by men who are predators looking for people to prey upon. So the judgment that accorded these rights enabled a lot of changes around this, and that was great. There was also another judgment that decriminalized consensual sex, which the British had imposed this law which stayed on the books, saying that sex against the order of nature would be criminalized, and that was also rolled back. So that these two were great judgments. Now, the Transgender Act does not sort of take forward the Nalsa judgment and, in fact, rolls back the right to self-recognition of our genders, suggesting that we should now apply to the government saying, I'm a transgender person, please recognize me as such. And then one has to provide proof of surgery in order to get any binary gender markers. The law suggests that for, say, a sexual assault, again, trigger warnings for a sexual assault on a trans person, that the punishment will be a minimum of 6 months and a maximum of 2 years. This isn't even, this falls in the category of what would be called station bailable. Somebody would not even have to go to court to get bail after perpetrating such. Whereas would be punishment of 7 years and opposed to the death penalty, but you can see in how it attacks trans persons and problem with the law. Yeah. Go ahead.
The sound is a bit shaky, but I was going to ask you to try.
Okay.
We're going to open up for our group discussion with all the panelists.
Right. Yeah, of course. So that's it. Actually, our fundamental right movement have been restricted by the law, and they say we must be rehabilitated. That if we should either live with our parents or approach the court. So there are fundamental concepts.
Yeah, thank you.
And stay have been impinged by this law. Protection in education environment to health facilities, none of them are by the law. So that is.
All right, now I don't hear anything right now from you, Karthik, but thank you very much. It was really insightful. It's really interesting to hear about how class and LGBTQI matters intertwine with each other, and how we see a spillover effect from persecution of Muslims, which is very present in Europe as well, to LGBTQI people. But we have all listened to each other now, and it has been really insightful. And really great listening to you all. But my question to you now, as a group, so whoever feels that I want to grab the word when I'm done, just grab the word. But really, what similarities do you see between our different contexts, and how do you think that we can apply those similarities, but also, knowledge from differences to strengthen our movements and LGBTQI rights around the world? Because there are some really striking similarities when it comes to white supremacy, racism,